So we may start understanding international monetary economics as an academic discipline means considering that its proper subject is the international monetary system. History should matter as much as money intended as an institution. Money is the first economic institution, and for example, different monies lead to different economic relations and presuppose also different economic relations, also at historical level. Let me consider as first step of my speech the following sentence. Today, we have no international monetary system. We have just global imbalances. To establish money, that is also to regulate international monetary system, we should thinking about money. Monetary historians, for instance, Cipolla, Polanyi, but also the annals with Bloch, knew the point. Today it is not simple because economic thought is characterized by different approaches that reflect different ideas about society, about social relations, and about money too. At least one of these approaches, as I will explain, consider money not as an institution, but as a simple tool. To understand today's monetary disorders, economic histories should be helpful. Our situation today is, in a sense, a consequence of a big historical event, the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Bretton Woods collapse. So, let's begin with Bretton Woods device. We have two different explanations in the history of economic thought about Bretton Woods collapse. The mainstream one and the post-Keynesian one. The first one is an approach that explains the collapse of the system by analyzing the relations between the inflation pressures and the economic policy by United States, especially the Vietnam War, the big war expenses, and also the increasing social expenses after the so-called Great Society Experiment. The point is that Bretton Woods collapse is related to the unwillingness of Europe, and in general of foreign countries, to import US inflation. On the other hand, we have the post-Keynesian explanation, and the starting point is a different analysis of the inflation during 60s and 70s. The analysis is centered on the consequences of full employment in terms of increasing bargaining power by working classes that implies higher nominal wages, and this lead to higher prices. For that reason, the abandonment of Bretton Woods is not connected to the loss of credibility in the face of higher inflation, but to the role of financial liberalization from the 60s, and financial liberalization is explained as a sort of answer of capital class to the increasing power of working classes. By means of financial liberalization, for example, this is very clear in a very interesting book by Andrew Green, Unleashed Capitalism, by means of financial liberalization, we had a sort of stimulus to restructurate the industry inside the United States in favor of Wall Street. Both the theories do not consider a very noisy historical fact. De Gaulle reclaiming in the 60s that showed the institutional fragility of Bretton Woods system. So, incidentally, again, when we analyze the problem of monetary economic system, history, and in this case political history, matter a lot. But come back to the problem that is the focus of my speech, the differences between neoclassical and Keynesian approaches regarding international monetary economics. So, what kind of monetary thought may be useful to establish a balanced international monetary system? I will present a personal journey in economic theories to sustain that we need to develop a non-orthodox approach to the problem. Here you may see the essence of the neoclassical view of the functioning of the economic system as a whole, which is seen as the aggregate or representative outcome of individual behaviors. And we may pinpoint by means of a Fisher-type simplified model of general economic equilibrium consisting of the few equations needed to describe the relations between fundamental quantities and prices, and dated back to the first 30 years of the 20th century. The dominant economists themselves have corrected, supplemented, and extended this elementary model, while preserving, however, its analytical core. The first step that you may see in this part of the graph is the analysis of the labor market. And the model is developed in accordance with a precise causal order regards the labor market where the demand for labor and the supply of labor meet. Since entrepreneurs' aim is the maximization of profit, they have to decide the proportion in which to combine labor and machinery. Their demand for labor will therefore depend on whether it is economically advantageous to replace workers with machineries or vice versa. If the cost of labor is high, entrepreneurs will find it advantageous to adopt techniques of production with low intensity of labor and vice versa. It should be noted that the cost of labor is given by the real wages. It has the purchasing power of the monetary wage as determined by its relation to the level of prices. There is thus an inversely proportional relation between the demand for labor and real wages for entrepreneurs. For workers, whose objective is the maximization of well-being, the supply of labor is instead directly proportional to real wages. If wages are high, workers will prefer more hours of work to more free time. There is one and only one equilibrium level of real wages at which the supply of and demand for labor are equal. Moreover, there will also be full employment at this level in the sense that there will be no involuntary unemployment or at most some low degree of natural or frictional unemployment. When addressing the different economic theories, it is always necessary to consider their implication in terms of economic policy. Here, they are obvious. If there is involuntary unemployment, it will be necessary and sufficient to ensure greater downward flexibility of real wages by removing any rigidities from labor markets, for example, trade union activities. The second step is represented by the analysis of good market. That means the analysis, first of all, of the production. Why? Because in this framework is relevant the so-called say law. This state that supply creates its own demand because the production of goods also produces the income with which those goods will be bought, and because of that income will be spent. The latter is the result of market mechanism capable of ensuring that the income not consumed, it has saved, is channeled entirely into investment. The task now is therefore to see whether there exists a mechanism capable of ensuring that saving and investments are equal at every level of saving. According to neoclassical economists, this mechanism exists and can be identified as the movement of the interest rate on the market of loanable funds. When the interest rate drops, it becomes advantageous for entrepreneurs to increase their volume of investment, and there is always a level of the interest rate such that the volume of investment is able of absorbing any amount of saving. This is another way to describe exactly the equilibrium fixed on the production system by believing in sale of. The aggregate demand for goods thus comes to depend on the level of the real interest rate, the interest rate being regarded here not as institutional, neither a monetary phenomenon, a variable affected not by monetary policy, but as a price determined on the market for goods. The only institution is the market that may work, given the reductive vision of this mainstream economics. There is also another market, the money market. But as you will have noted, money is never mentioned in the argument outlined so far. This is because money is neutral, in the sense that it is supposedly does not affect the real magnitudes of economy, namely employment and production. The monetary mass available in the economy for the exchange of goods produced is equal to the amount of money introduced into the economy by the monetary authority. Juxtaposed with this monetary mass is the monetary value of the real income, which is given by its magnitude in physical terms multiplied by the general level of prices. This relation is derived from the Fisher equation of exchanges, that is quite famous, I suppose, and starting from Fisher equation, we may obtain the so-called quantity theory of money. A theory of money may be defined as quantitative if we introduce behavioral hypotheses on the level of prices, on the amount of transactions of goods, and on the velocity of circulation of money. So, the idea is that because of the sale law, we will have always number of transactions fixed at full employment level. Again, given the statistics, velocity of circulation is considered as constant, at least in the long run. So we have just a causal nexus that we have to decide between the amount of supplied money and the level of prices. And the hypothesis introduced in the traditional neoclassical model is that the amount of money is the independent variable that rules the movement of prices. So again, what is the political implication of the quantitative theory of money is that the monetary institution must control the amount of money to avoid inflationary pressures. What are the consequences for international monetary economics? Orthodox economists pretended to formulate a satisfactory explanation of exchange rates determination related primarily to their predilection with the idea that fundamental forces must be responsible for currency price determination. The fundamentals are those variables that, if allowed to determine exchange rates, guarantee an efficient market and the optimal allocation of world resources. Following this line of thought, the core mainstream exchange rate theory is purchasing power parity. Once exchange rates are taken into account, the average price of goods and services worldwide should be equal. If the relationship does not hold, then it must be that merchandise is cheaper in one art than the other. Again, this sets into motion natural forces, particularly the so-called arbitrage, that will restore the equality. Consequently, the balance of payments analysis is reduced to the analysis of trade balance, and the trade balance should drive the exchange rate. In other words, there's a systematic tendency for balanced trade to emerge as the equilibrium. Particularly, the portfolio capital flows play no role. In other words, financial liberalization cannot be destabilizing because the capital outflow and the capital inflows are simply consequences of import and exports. They may move export and imports in future, but they are not analyzed as isolated problems. There is a long-run equilibrium. By considering together the purchasing power parity theory and quantity theory of money, as we did in the equation inside the slide, we may simply derive some political implication for the economic system at international level. First of all, central banks should control the amount of supplied money, directly or indirectly, and with this tool they may obtain two different aims. First of all, control inflationary pressure inside national economy. Secondly, they may also stabilize the exchange rate volatility. Second political implication, central banks should fix targets by considering worldwide natural rates of unemployment. Third, also worldwide velocities of money should be checked by central banks. Consequently, if central banks are able to coordinate this kind of interventions, then not only inflation but also exchange rates volatility should be taken under control. A corollary of this approach is that unstable exchange rates are caused by unstable policies, not by destabilizing speculation. Again, a word capable of self-regulation emerge from this very simple way to describe the analysis of mainstream economics. It is widely believed that as long as an economic system is healthy, efforts must focus first and foremost on keeping the rate of inflation down. That is Taylor's rule that dominates. As Taylor wrote in a famous contribution in 1993, the policy rule in Taylor equation has the feature that the federal funds rate rises if inflation increases above a target of 2% or if real GDP rises above trend GDP. This policy rule has the same coefficient on the deviation of real GDP from trend and the inflation rate. The concept of an equilibrium rate of inflation is associated again with the idea that there is a natural rate of unemployment, as was represented in the very simple aggregate model I explained before. As regards the latter, the natural rate of unemployment, Franco Modigliani once asked, who decides the natural rate of unemployment? According to a reliable witness, Modigliani answered, Friedman and I do. Taylor's rule and variants of the same, maintaining the need for a conservative central banker or the institutionalization of aversion to inflation can be understood through reference to the quantitative theory of money. However, the dominant idea during this last decade, known as the new consensus, which has triumphed above all within the European Central Bank, is rather that the interest rate can serve as a tool of indirect control over inflation. This presupposes that we proceed as though there were a natural rate of interest compatible with the steady state growth rate in which the full utilization of resources obtains. As you know, to maintain price stability is the primary objective of the euro system and of the single monetary policy for which it is responsible. This is laid down in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, Article 127. Without prejudice to the objective of price stability, the Eurosystem shall also support the general economic policies in the Union with a view to contributing to the achievement of the objectives of the Union. These include inter alia full employment and balanced economic growth. The treaty established a clear hierarchy of objectives for the Eurosystem. It assigns overriding importance to price stability. The treaty makes it clear that ensuring price stability is the most important contribution that monetary policy can make to achieve a favorable economic environment and a high level of employment. But, pay attention to this point, in examining this kind of economic policies actually implemented, it is then necessary to distinguish between what an institution says it is doing and what it does in practice, between the model it claims to believe in and the rules it actually follows to attain the objectives it really pursues. Suffice it to consider the monetary policies put into effect by Federal Reserve after 2008 and also nowadays to European Central Bank. So it could be interesting considering if this actual way to organize and to put down economic policies for international monetary system may be influenced by other kind of theory. For example, the so-called heterodox approach to monetary theory. The core concept of neoclassicism has created two principal problems. First, since efficiency and optimality are function of the independent, subjective, and unobservable utility function of all market participants, it is never clear whether the empirical failure of a fundamentals-based model for forecasting the exchange rate movement, for example, is because the basic theory is flawed, or simply that the researcher has incorrectly specified the fundamental variables. Second problem. The specification of the fundamentals in mainstream economic models has been restricted to those factors that economists have thought should determine exchange rates. As the internationalization of capital has increased and brought into the foreign exchange market more and more disparate players, the problem has become worse. The stability of rates since 1973, after the collapse of Bretton Woods system, has been the turning point. Following mainstream approach, some of the changes in exchange rates can be attributed to differences in national inflation rates. It is a consequence of the purchasing power parity. If the delta of the exchange rates must be equal to the delta of the ratio between the level of prices in different nations, then you may also explain the volatility of exchange rates by starting with the analysis of the volatility or the change in the inflation rate. But yearly changes in exchange rates have been much larger than can be explained by differences in inflation rates or in other variables such as different growth rates in various countries' money supplies. This is a very famous graph that you may find, for example, in the International Monetary Economics textbook by Krugman and Hofsfeld, and it is also strong by changing the currencies that you compute. So, exchange rates between currencies have been highly unstable since the collapse of Bretton Woods system, and the stability of exchange rates in 70s, 80s, 90s, and also nowadays will not have surprised the founders of Bretton Woods system, who had a deep distrust of financial market liberalization. The previous experience with floating exchange rates in the 20s had been marked by massive instability, as John Maynard Keynes and other scholars during the 40s knew well. Coming back to Keynes' thought should be helpful. So, let's present the core, possible representation of the core of Keynes' scheme. Unlike a model of general economic equilibrium, Keynes' argument starts from the idea that markets of goods and money are not independent of one another. The latter has an effect on the former through the influence of the interest rate on investments, and the former by determining the level of production and income, has an effect on the latter through the demand for money required for transaction. In Keynes' view, the interest rate is not determined by real phenomena, but by purely monetary magnitude, decided by monetary institutions. The task is therefore to explain the historical, institutional, and also conventional circumstances that influence the state of the money market. The relation between the demand for money and the interest rates depends on the existence of speculative motives, i.e., the desire to hold resources in liquid form in order to take advantage of the market, especially in the market for bonds, pocketing the difference between the current and the future price. According to Keynes, uncertainty as to the future trend of the interest rate is the only intelligible explanation of speculative demand, which depends on the relation between the current rate and expectation as to a normal or safe rate. If the current interest rate is below the normal, agents will a conventional norm. Agents will generally expect it to increase and share prices to fall. As a result, they will prefer to hold money rather than securities, and the speculative demand will be high. In actual fact, speculative demand is inversely proportional to the interest rate. It is zero when interest rates are very high, because all agents expect them to drop towards a normal level and fear that the loss of interest will be so great that it cannot be offset by the capital gains made possible by the increase in market prices. Conversely, there will be a very low level of the interest rate at which the expectation that it will rise and the market value of securities will fall is so general that all agents will want to sell their holdings for speculative money. In this situation, which is known as the liquidity trap, an expansive monetary policy therefore proves ineffective. And this is also nowadays situation in Europe, let me say. The interest rate in this context is not a recompense for saving or abstinence as such. In point of fact, if people hoard their savings in the form of money, they earn no interest even though they save exactly as much as before. The interest rate is instead recompense for foregoing liquidity for a certain period. It measures, wrote Keynes, the reluctance of those who possess money to relinquish their liquid control over it. It is not the price that establishes equilibrium between the demand for resources to invest and willingness to abstain from present consumption. It is instead the price that balances the desire to hold wealth in the form of money and the amount of money available. So the causal order of the Keynesian relation thus presents itself as you may see there. First of all, it is necessary to consider the factors that determine the level of effective demand and investments, namely expectations, which can be taken as exogenous, and the level of the interest rate, which depends, given the liquidity preference, on the supply of money. Effective demand determines the level of income and hence of saving which serves to finance the autonomous demand constituted by investments. In a certain sense, the money market, but also the international monetary system, precedes the market of goods in the causal order. Let me add just a point, because here, to describe what happens now, we should change the position of rate of interest and the position of the amount of supplied money because of the Taylor rule. Central banks at international level coordinate themselves to check supplied money not directly, but by means of rate of interest. And let me also consider the fact that we should introduce another influence of the expectation also in the consequences of the decision by central banks on the rate of interest. So, here we have the institutional context that precedes what may happen in terms of effective demand. Obviously, the consequence is that the employment level is an equilibrium level of employment, but this equilibrium may admit always not voluntary unemployment. The position of equilibrium in terms of voluntary unemployment may be reached by accident or design in Keynesian analysis. So, the equilibrium on the money market depends on the state of expectation, which influences the demand for money for speculative purposes, as well as the money in circulation. This set of circumstances determines the level of interest rates, the amount of investment that corresponds to a certain interest rate depends in turn on expectation, and together with the amount of consumption, which depends on the community's propensity to consume, the volume of investment determines the level of income, and the level of income determines the level of employment. What are the consequences for the international monetary economics? The starting point for a truly Keynesian approach to international monetary economics is the analysis of the demand of liquidity. As seen, according to Keynes, demand for liquidity is determined by transactive motive, precautionary motive, and moreover, speculative motive. Consequently, the expectation and the institutional and conventional nature of interest rates do matter in the determination of the exchange rates. The full employment income cannot be considered as an equilibrium, so it may vary. The rate of interest may influence both the speed of circulation of money, that is not constant, and income through the investment. The role of expectation is crucial to determine the rate of interest itself and the national income through investment, but also capital flows. That is a very relevant component of in the analysis of balance of payments to explain exchange rates volatility. Following this line of thought, we may try to study the exchange rate volatility by reinterpreting the so-called uncovered interest rate parity. As you may say, uncovered rate of interest parity may be described in this way. Rate of return one could earn on an interest-bearing asset in a country, for example USA, must be equal to the same amount translated into foreign currency earned and then repatriated. If we obtain the exchange rate by simple algebra, you may see that the change in exchange rate will depend on the spread between the rate of interest, but also by expectation of future exchange rate. For neoclassical theory, this is a description of the short run, and by means of a specific theory of expectation, the famous rational expectation model proposed by Robert Lucas and Chicago Boys, the model, in the long run, determines that the exchange rates are at the same level of the exchange rate fixed following the rule of purchasing power parity. The problem here, for a Keynesian analysis of the international monetary system and particularly of the volatility of the exchange rates, is introducing a different theory of expectation by combining also a different analysis of the interest rates. Okay. So, the famous Dorbush model is exactly a way to explain the phenomenon of the volatility of the exchange rates by introducing some differences in the neoclassical model, inspired in a sense on the short-run analysis by Keynesian economists. But the Dorbush model is an hybrid. In the short run it obtains Keynesian results, but in the long run it obtains, by means of the rational expectation hypothesis, the monetary model results. There's a very famous critique by Mies and Rogoff. A truly remarkable paper was published in 1983. The question was which of the existent exchange rate models generate the best forecast. To their surprise, nothing could outperform a random walk. That is a not model. It's the model of the drunk man walking. So, my impression is that we should rethinking monetary institution, coming back again to Keynes, but to a different Keynes. Should be helpful because what mainstream economists nowadays are calling irrationality in the behaviors of markets, of financial markets, should be seen and analyzed as conventional judgments of financial markets itself. In spite of the intellectual appeal of the overshooting hypothesis, many economists have returned to the idea that destabilizing speculation is the principal cause of exchange rate instability. To fix the point, I suggest to study together, or if you want to read in the Oxbridge sense, Keynes' treatise of probability and the general theory, especially chapter 17. And to think about the following conclusive sentence of my speech. It's a letter to Roy Harvard by John Maynard Keynes in 1938 about Tinbergen econometrics. I also want to emphasize strongly the point about economics being a moral science. I mentioned before that it deals with introspection and with values. I might have added that it deals with motives, expectation, psychological uncertainties. It is as though the fall of the apple to the ground depended on the apple's motives, on whether it is worthwhile falling to the ground and whether the ground wanted the apple to fall, and on mistaken calculations on the part of the apple as to how far it was from the center of the earth. And I know that it could be strange, but I suppose also that nowadays Mario Draghi knows well this approach to the international monetary economics. Thank you very much for your attention.